Section 7 of Louis Pasteur by Albert Keim and Louis Lumet. Translated by Frederick Tabor Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 4. For the National Wealth, Part 2. Pasteur left Paris in the early days of June 1865 and installed himself at Pont-Biquet in a small silkworm farm near Alais, in the very heart of the stricken district. The diseases of silkworms had already been studied by Guérin, Menville, Lebert, and Frey, Osimo, Cantoni, and Quatrefages, the latter of whom gave its name to the most redoubtable of these diseases, pébrine. In this disease the bodies of the infected worms became covered over with spots resembling grains of pepper. It was known in a vague way that it was caused by corpuscles, but when it became a question of determining their nature and the manner of their invasion, there was nothing but darkness and contradictions. As for remedies, they were purely empirical. Resort was had to sulphur, sugar, ground mustard, ashes, etc., and all of them were quite in vain. Pasteur had to find his way through an inextricable labyrinth, without any special knowledge, and armed solely with his intuitive mind and his unrivalled qualities as an investigator. In his Histoire d'un Esprit, Duclos, who together with Guernet and Maillot was his collaborator at Pont-Biquet, relates all the fluctuations of that 6 years' struggle, with its mistakes, its hopes, and its discouragements, surrounded by the indifference and the hostility of those whose interests it disturbed, and the final triumph, assured, indisputable, and universally acclaimed. At the very beginning, Pasteur made the mistake of thinking that the corpuscles were the result of pébrine, and that they did not make their appearance until the disease had reached a certain stage. But notwithstanding that he was wrong in this, he established the fact that corpusculous moths produced corpusculous eggs, and that the whole problem was to find a way of obtaining healthy eggs. In this way he opened up the path to the truth. After experiments of unimagined delicacy which demanded ceaseless watchfulness, Pasteur convinced himself that the corpuscles were not an effect of the disease, but its cause, a form of parasite that invaded the bodies of the silkworms. He proved that pébrine was hereditary and contagious, and that the variations that were shown to occur in the disease were due solely to the state of receptivity of the individual insects, according as they were more or less sensitive to the action of the parasite. Here we have in embryo the theory of microbic diseases, which was destined a few years later to revolutionize the science of medicine. Pasteur converted himself into a cultivator of silkworms, and after many alterations between success and defeat, he obtained eggs that were perfectly healthy. His method was simple. After the moths had finished laying, he reduced their bodies to a pulp and examined them under a microscope, and every batch of eggs that was thus shown to have come from a corpusculous moth was destroyed. This operation, although so simple, encountered desperate opposition on the part of the vendors of silkworm eggs, with whose trade it interfered. It required all of Pasteur's energy to overcome this opposition, and all his activity as well, for he had to respond to all the appeals of the silk producers who sought his eggs or his advice as to the best methods to follow. A campaign of insults and calumnies was organized against the great man, and it is even stated that he once had to seek safety in Alais, followed by an angry mob that stoned him as he went. Pasteur was keenly sensitive to such malevolent attacks, but none the less he continued his task. Rising early in the morning, he would stand for long hours before the cases of silkworms, making observations and recording the daily results of his experiments, never discouraged, or at least overcoming by force of will, those moments when the desired goal seemed as remote as ever, and proceeding to begin his work over again, to correct his opinions in accordance with the newly observed facts, with no intention of halting until he should hold within his powerful grasp the indisputable truth. What a heroic battle! It must not be forgotten that Pasteur hardly knew what silkworms were when he undertook to cure them. The celebrated entomologist Henri Fabre relates in his Souvenirs the details of a visit that Pasteur paid him upon arriving in the South. Pasteur requested to see some cocoons. Fabre brought him a handful. The illustrious scientist took them in his hand, turned and returned them, shook them near his ear, and exclaimed, "Why, there's something inside!" "The chrysalis," replied Fabre. "The chrysalis? What's that?" "A sort of mummy into which the caterpillar changes before becoming a moth." "And inside of every cocoon there's one of those things?" "Certainly. It is to protect the chrysalis that the caterpillar spins its cocoon." "Ah," responded Pasteur simply. Is not this an admirable scene as described by the old entomologist Fabre? Pasteur knew nothing. Pasteur worked, observed, drew deductions, came to a conclusion, and where everyone else had failed, he alone succeeded. Such is the power of genius. The work upon silkworms had its interruptions, for Pasteur tried to reconcile his personal researches with his functions as director of scientific studies at the École Normale. But in any case he was forced to abandon them in 1867 as the result of a small rebellion among the students, due to a discourse delivered by Sainte-Beuve before the Senate on the subject of freedom of opinion. The school had been dismissed, and the directors Nisard, Pasteur, and Jacquenet replaced in the course of reorganization. The Minister of Public Instruction, Duret, appointed Pasteur professor of chemistry at the Sorbonne. But where was he to find a new laboratory? The only adequate one at the École Normale was occupied by Sainte Claire Deville, and it was impossible even to think of returning to the wretched quarters where the experiments on spontaneous generation had been made. Then it was that Pasteur, who in spite of his personal modesty was conscious of all that he was still able to do for science, requested that a laboratory should be constructed for him. This request was made in a note of such an exalted tone that it deserves to be reproduced in its entirety. It was addressed to Napoleon III. "Sire," wrote Pasteur, "my researches in regard to fermentations and the rôle played by microscopic organisms have opened up to physiological chemistry new avenues of which the agricultural industries and the study of medicine have already begun to reap the fruit. But the field which remains to be traversed is immense. My greatest desire would be to explore this field with renewed ardor, without being hampered by the insufficiency of material means. Since it involves seeking by a patient and scientific study of putrefaction for certain principles capable of guiding us to a discovery of the causes of putrid or contagious diseases, I should like to be installed in some building where the laboratory and its various dependencies would afford enough space to carry on the experiments comfortably and without danger to health. But how can researches be conducted in relation to gangrene, the viruses, and experiments in inoculation, unless we have quarters suitable for receiving animals, whether alive or dead? Butcher's meat brings an exorbitant price in Europe, but it is a superfluity in Buenos Aires. How is it possible, in a cramped laboratory, lacking in the necessary resources, to apply all the various tests to processes which perhaps render the preservation and transportation of meat a simple matter? The disease properly known as sang de rat, splenic apoplexy, causes in the district of Beauce an annual loss of 4 million francs. It would be indispensable to go there, no doubt for several successive seasons, at the period of the greatest heat, and spend several weeks in the environs of Charente in order to carry on a series of minute observations. These researches, and 1,000 others, which according to my belief are related to the great phenomenon of the transformation of organic matter after death, and the enforced return of every living thing to the soil and the atmosphere, are compatible only with the installation of a vast laboratory. The time has come to emancipate the experimental sciences from the obstacles which trammel them. Napoleon III responded to this eloquent appeal, in which Pasteur outlined, to a certain extent, the programme of his future work. He gave an order to Duret to gratify this legitimate desire of the scientist and the Minister of Public Instruction, that a laboratory should be built for him by the State in the gardens of the École Normale. But they needs must reckon with administrative delays. The plans were handed in by the architect of the École, M. Pouchot, in accordance with Pasteur's specifications, in September 1867. But the actual work was delayed until a year later, after Pasteur had denounced in a pamphlet the budget de la science, the lamentable conditions under which French scientists were obliged to conduct their experiments, as compared with scientists in other countries, and notably in Germany. Meanwhile, a catastrophe was about to befall Pasteur and even menace his life. On the 19th of October, 1868, he was prostrated by an attack of paralysis on the left side, and so gravely affected that for the first 24 hours a fatal termination was feared. Pasteur rallied from the crisis, thanks to the robustness of his constitution, and it was during those days of physical and mental suffering, while he lay motionless as though stricken by a thunderbolt, that he revealed most vividly the loftiness of his thoughts, the beauty of his character, and the stoic grandeur of his principles. On the second afternoon of his illness, Dr. Godelier, who was attending him, was enabled to make the following announcement in his health bulletin: "He wishes to talk about science." In reply to Sainte Claire de Ville, who had spoken some affectionate words of encouragement, he uttered the following admirable phrase: "I regret to die. I should like to have been of more service to my country." His preoccupation as a scientist never for an instant left him, as Dr. Godelier himself attested, and 8 days after his attack he dictated a note to M. Guernay, his assistant, in relation to the disease of silkworms. Pasteur was surrounded with the most devoted care of his family, and also by his pupils, who loved him as they might have loved a father who was somewhat cold, somewhat distant, but who hid beneath an external reserve a warm heart ever ready to defend his friends. Messieurs Guernay, Duclos, Rollin, Didon, and Berton took turns in watching beside him, anxiously following the successive phases of his illness. The whole scientific world was troubled, as though facing the possibility of a great disaster, and Napoleon III himself demanded news every morning. 6 weeks after his attack, Pasteur was able to rise and entered upon his convalescence. He had been affected badly by the stoppage of the work upon his laboratory, which had coincided with the beginning of his illness, but by the order of the Emperor it had been resumed, and from his window Pasteur could see the foundations beginning to rise. The hope of soon being able to recommence his experiments with the help of material means, such as he had long desired, hastened his cure. While he rested his body, he went into a sort of spiritual retirement. He read, or had read to him, the thoughts of Pascal, the knowledge of God and of oneself, and the works of Nicole. This man of science, unique in his qualities as an experimenter, who would abandon any and every theory in the face of facts, always separated science from faith, and it is known that he was a practical Catholic to the day of his death. As soon as he could be removed, Pasteur wished to return to the south of France, in order to continue his study of silkworms and clear up certain points which seemed to him to be still obscure. He disregarded all suggestions of prudence, and in spite of his weakened condition he installed himself, in January 1869, at Saint-Hippolyte-du-Pont, near Alais. Shortly after his arrival, Pasteur, who still moved his left arm and leg clumsily, fell to the ground and once more had to take to his bed. But he none the less continued to work, dictating the experiments to be made to his collaborators, Guernay, Roland, and Maillet, and informing himself each day of the observations they had gathered. His method was still combated, and while certain silk producers declared that it was excellent, certain organized bodies, such as the Silk Commission of Lyons, questioned its value. Pasteur forwarded to the members of this commission several samples of eggs, indicating in advance what result each of the samples should give. The boldness of his predictions was a proof of his certainty, and as a matter of fact they were realized. Nevertheless, his adversaries refused to lay down their arms, even though his processes began to be employed abroad, and the Austrian government awarded him a prize of 10,000 francs in recognition of the services he had rendered to the culture of silkworms. Not only did Pasteur find a cure for pébrine, but also for another disease of silkworms known as flacherie, which was almost as much dreaded as the former. Maréchal Vaillant, minister of the House to Napoleon III, decided to try the Pasteur method experimentally in one of the domains of the Crown. A vast property planted with mulberry trees was chosen. It belonged to the Prince Imperial, and was situated at Villa Vicentina in Austrian Friuli. Pasteur set forth in November 1869 with healthy eggs obtained by his process of cellular breeding from 3 cultivators, Messieurs Rebaud, Millot, and Gourdin, and immediately upon arriving he set to work. For the previous 10 years the imperial domain, infected with pébrine and flacherie, had produced nothing, while the harvest resulting from Pasteur's eggs gave a net profit of 22,000 francs. It formed a neat little surplus for the purse of the Prince Imperial. Pasteur remained for 8 months at Villa Vicentina, and there put the finishing touches to his work, in which he systematized all his previous studies on silkworms. His former master Dumas had the pleasure of introducing to the Academy of Science at a meeting held the 11th of April, 1870, and of pronouncing the eulogy on his Studies on the Disease of Silkworms, a Practical and Assured Method of Combating It and Preventing its Return. The Academy had spoken, the victory was complete. Pasteur had been made Senator of the Empire by a decree issued the previous July, and he was returning to France, impatient to begin new researches, when he learned at Strasbourg, with an inexpressible sinking of the heart, that war had been declared. This meant the postponement of all his projects, of all those researches which he wished to undertake for the benefit of humanity. The scientists no longer had the floor. End of section 7. Section 8 of Louis Pasteur by Albert Keim and Louis Lumet. Translated by Frederick Tabor Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 5. The Spirit of Patriotism. Pasteur was an ardent patriot, and the disasters of France affected him profoundly. Determined though he was to work in spite of the war, since he had nothing else than his work to give to his country, it was nevertheless hard for him to reconcile himself, so keenly did he share the high tension of public feeling. Retiring to his boyhood home at Arbois, he sought to content himself with studying the fermentation of tan bark. Yet all the while he was on the alert for news, and quivering in unison with the soul of the nation at the announcement of each new defeat. When Paris was bombarded and shells reached the Museum of Natural History, Chevreul's eloquent and indignant protest in the name of the Academy of Sciences caused Pasteur to regret that he had not been in Paris in order to sign it, together with his colleagues who were present. But he remembered that in 1868 he had received a diploma from the University of Bonn, conferring upon him the honorary degree of Doctor of Medicine in recognition of his brilliant work, and he decided to return it to the Dean. He accompanied it with a letter pulsating throughout with the highest kind of patriotism. To Monsieur the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine of Bonn, Rhenish Prussia, Arbois, Jura, January 18th, 1871. Monsieur the Dean, in 1868 the Faculty of Medicine of the University of Bonn did me the honor to confer upon me voluntarily the degree of Doctor of Medicine in recognition of my work in regard to fermentations and the role played by microscopic organisms. Among all the distinctions bestowed upon me by reason of the discoveries which I have been privileged to make since entering upon my scientific career 22 years ago, there is none, I acknowledge, which caused me greater satisfaction. It was, in my eyes, the confirmation of a secret hope, of the truth of which I felt more and more convinced, namely, that my researches were opening up new horizons to the study of medicine. I even hastened to frame under glass that honorary degree which bore witness to the decision of your faculty, and I adorned the wall of my private office with it. Today the sight of this same parchment has become odious to me, and I feel that it is an insult to have my name, with the qualification of virum clarissimum which you bestowed upon it, placed under the auspices of a name condemned henceforth to the execration of my country, that of Rex Guilelmus. While protesting loudly my profound respect toward you and all the other celebrated professors who signed their names at the foot of the document representing the decision of the members of your order, I must still obey the voice of my conscience and beg you to erase my name from the archives of your faculty, and to take back this diploma as a sign of the indignation aroused in a French savant by the barbarity and hypocrisy of the man who, for the sake of satisfying a criminal pride, obstinately insists upon the massacre of two great nations. Since the conference of Ferrières, France has sought for the respect of human dignity, and Prussia for the triumph of the most abominable of lies, namely, that the future peace of Germany depends upon the dismemberment of France, although every sane man knows that the conquest of Alsace and Lorraine is simply a prize of war carried to the bitter end. Woe to the people of Germany if, being nearer than we to feudal servitude, they do not understand that France, while possessing the lands of Alsace and Lorraine, is not mistress of the consciences of their inhabitants. Savoy would still be a part of Piedmont if its inhabitants had not consented by a free vote to become French. Such is the modern right of civilized nations which your king is trampling under foot, and in defense of which France has risen. Therefore there is perhaps no epoch of her history in which France has better deserved to be called the great nation, the initiator of progress, the guiding light of other races. Here is a whole people which has arisen against you, ready to push onward to the ends of the earth and to dare everything because of her conviction of the justice and sanctity of her cause. Kindly accept, Monsieur the Dean, on behalf of yourself and your distinguished colleagues, the expression of my sentiments of high consideration, Louis Pasteur, member of the Institute. In the white heat of conflict between two powerful nations, this reasonable and humane letter, couched in terms of such noble pride, could not be understood. Dr. Neumann, Dean of the Faculty of Bonn, replied harshly, with an affectation of disdain under which he betrayed the irritation caused by this great and well-merited lesson. Pasteur, strong in the conviction that he and his nation were in the right, wrote a second letter, no longer indignant, but saddened and deploring the murderousness of war, which puts a barrier between men who were born to understand each other and to join forces in the search of happiness. He wrote, Monsieur the Dean, in rereading your letter and my own, I feel sick at heart to think that men like you and myself, who have consecrated their lives to a search after the truth and to the progress of the human mind, could address each other in such terms, and based for my own part upon such acts. Nevertheless, we have there one other result of the character imprinted upon this war by your Emperor. You speak to me of degradation, Monsieur the Dean. There is degradation, be assured of that, and there will continue to be, down to the remotest epochs of time, attached to the memory of those who began the bombardment of Paris at a date when capitulation through famine was inevitable, and who continued this savage act when it had become evident to everyone that it would not hasten by a single hour the surrender of the heroic city. Louis Pasteur. To the anguish of patriotism there were added private anxieties, for Pasteur's son, who was only 18 years old, was serving as quartermaster in the Army of the East under the command of Bourbaki. Having been for a long time without news, Pasteur set out to seek for him among the demoralized troops in full retreat and destined finally to take refuge in Switzerland. He had the good fortune to find him in that disorganized crowd, emaciated, exhausted, but still living. After a few days of repose at Geneva, this son, well worthy of his father, returned with him to France and re-entered the service in the Army of National Defense. International war was soon followed by civil war, and Pasteur, being unable either to enter Paris or to return to Arbois, which was occupied by the enemy, proceeded to install himself early in 1871 in the house of his friend and collaborator Émile Duclos, who at that time was professor of chemistry in the faculty of Clermont-Ferrand. He wrote to him on the 29th of March, 1871, I have my head filled with the finest projects for work, but the war has forced my brain to lie fallow. I feel ready now to become productive again, although, alas, I may be deceiving myself. In any case, I shall try. Ah, why am I not rich, a millionaire? I should then say to you and to Rollin and Guerney and Fantigam and the rest, come, we are going to transform the world by our discoveries. How fortunate you are to be young and in good health. Oh, if I could only recommence a new life of study and toil. Poor France, dear motherland, if I could only contribute to relieve you from your disasters. At Clermont-Ferrand, Pasteur hesitated between several paths. Should he continue to devote himself to silkworms, or commence some new researches? Chance and the desire to do away with French consumption of an almost exclusive product of German industry turned his attention to the study of beer. Why should we not make good beer in France? Pasteur asked himself, and he straightway set to work to find an answer to his own question. There was a small brewery at Chamilières, near Clermont, and it was there, at the home of the proprietor, M. Kulm, that he conducted his first experiments, afterwards verified in Duclos' laboratory in the Faculty of Sciences. The microscopic examination of malts, yeasts, and beers soon convinced him that the latter acquired a bad taste through diseases analogous to those of wines and due to certain microbes. In brewing, just as in all industries where fermentation plays the principal role, the manufacture was purely empirical, without method or science, and the results, whether good or bad, were often due to pure chance. Pasteur resolved to place brewing on a firm basis, established through experiments, to the end that it should yield nothing but perfect products. Since beer was spoiled by the introduction of harmful germs, and its quality corresponded to the quality of the yeast which caused the fermentation, it was necessary on the one hand to eliminate germs, and on the other hand to obtain a thoroughly lively and perfectly pure yeast. These were the problems to which Pasteur applied himself, and during his sojourn at Clermont he manufactured beer according to his own rules, and was able to send 12 bottles of it to Dumas. But the brewery at Chamalières was too restricted a field. In September 1871 he set out for England, and he reduced the great London brewers to a point of stupefaction by pronouncing upon the quality of their different beers, those that were good and those that were bad, simply by examining them under a microscope. With their practical temperament, the English grasped the great benefit which their manufacture could derive from the method of the French scientist, and the microscope became a frequently consulted instrument in their breweries. Upon returning to Paris, and once more installed in his laboratory at the École Normale, Pasteur still continued his studies of beer. The problem to be solved was a very delicate one. As a matter of fact, a beer may be good, even perfect, and yet be unpalatable. For the question of taste intervenes quite aside from the quality of the manufacture. Now, for the purpose of carrying on this work of adaptation and of detail, writes M. Duclos, Pasteur had none of the essential requisites. He did not like beer, and although by force of will he succeeded in acquiring a sufficiently trained palate and a sense of taste, he remained unable to detect differences pointed out by the brewers themselves, and which he was sometimes amazed to find keenly appreciated by his friend Berton, who lived next to him in the École Normale as assistant director, and who was frequently invited into the laboratory for conferences over the relative flavor of samples. In the face of the enthusiastic appreciations sometimes expressed by his friend, Pasteur remained bewildered, feeling that they were leading him into regions where he did not like to venture, and he would forthwith have renounced this labor of Sisyphus if he had not had the imprudence to solicit the pecuniary aid of a certain society for investigations, a very large and generous society, toward which he had thus contracted a moral obligation to succeed in his enterprise. In order to arrive at the conclusion which he wished, the laboratory did not suffice his needs. Accordingly, Pasteur went to continue his researches at the great breweries belonging to the Tourtel brothers at Tantonville. Above all else, he recommended the most scrupulous cleanliness in all the manipulations and all the implements of manufacture. Let us here introduce a parenthesis for the purpose of pointing out the extent to which Pasteur insisted upon cleanliness in all the details of daily life. He never seated himself at table without carefully wiping his plates, his glass, his knife and fork, examining them all with the most severe attention. He never ate fruit that was not peeled, and he even scraped off the crust from his bread for fear that it might be infected with microbes. These habits were well known to his family, but they could not have failed to astonish his hostesses when he dined away from home. After a short sojourn at the Tourtel brothers' brewery, in company with his assistant, M. Grenet, Pasteur announced that all the diseases of beer arose from microbes, which could be avoided through precautions in the course of manufacture, that it was necessary to make careful selection of yeasts, and that if bottled beer was heated to the point of 122° Fahrenheit, it was rendered unalterable. His method and his processes have enabled France to cope successfully with foreign competition, and the Congress of French Brewers, held in 1889, attributed all the merit of their products to his labors. After the close of the war, the world of science so highly appreciated the genius of Pasteur that the celebrated Englishman Huxley did not hesitate to declare that his discoveries were worth the 5 billion ransom of France. And yet this was only the first part of his work, the part which, according to Duclos, had won him fame, while now he was about to enter upon the second part, devoted to human maladies, which was destined to assure him immortality. End of section 8. Section 9 of Louis Pasteur by Albert Keim and Louis Lumet, translated by Frederick Taber Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 6. The Curative Poison. Innovators, whether in the arts or the sciences, are combated at the outset. Pasteur was not destined to escape the general rule which demands that all truth shall be forced upon us. In spite of the evidence which he had obtained in support of his theories from long and difficult experiments with fermentations, a group of scientists, and they by no means the lesser lights, refused to accept his conclusions. He had to face a controversy with Trécul, who maintained that microscopic organisms could transform themselves one into another, and he must needs demonstrate that, contrary to this opinion, they remained fixed with a specific character. In the course of the study necessitated by this discussion, he made experiments on anaerobic, without air, and aerobic, with air, forms of life, and he discovered that a certain number of these organisms could pass from one mode of life to the other with an accompanying change in form and function. But these studies of fermentations, through which he was destined to refute Claude Bernard, Berthelot, etc., studies which he pursued with unflagging energy, and which were shedding light upon phenomena that had remained obscure until he had given the key to their interpretation, did not prevent him from pondering over the role played by microbes in infectious diseases, or from beginning experiments concerning them. Pasteur had been elected to full membership of the Academy of Medicine in 1873, and it was thenceforward there that he waged his battles against prejudice, hostility, and unfairness, in order to achieve the triumph of ideas which brought with them the most complete revolution that had ever taken place in medicine. Along the curve of an inspired path, and with no break in the continuity, he had passed from crystals to fermentations, and from fermentations to diseases of microbic origin. But these divisions were still in a measure inexact, for within his vast brain there was forever working all his projects for experimentation, all his ideas centered upon germs. Accordingly, he was able to say before the Academy of Medicine in 1873, "Is it not evident that all the researches to which I have devoted myself for 17 years, regardless of the efforts they have cost me, are the products of the same ideas, the same principles, forced by incessant toil to yield constantly new results? The best proof that an investigator is on the road to truth is the uninterrupted fertility of his labors." For years Pasteur was forced to fight his battles in the very midst of the Academy of Medicine, and he did so with a vigorous and dogged energy, so long as he was defending the truth contained in his discoveries. His work, for that matter, controverted though it was, had long since passed beyond the limits of scientific circles, and in 1874 the National Assembly, wishing to pay homage to his rare merit, awarded him a national recompense, one which had been granted only twice before within the century, in 1839 to Daguerre and Niepce, and in 1845 to the engineer Vicat. Paul Bert was appointed to make the report. In the course of it he said: "The discoveries of M. Pasteur after having shed new light upon the obscure question of fermentations and of the mode in which microscopic organisms make their appearance, have revolutionized certain branches of business, industry, agriculture, and pathology. One is struck with admiration when one realizes that so many results, and such widely different ones, have all been derived through an unbroken chain of facts, followed up step by step, leaving nothing to conjecture, from an original theoretical study as to the manner in which tartaric acid deflects polarized light. Never before has that famous epigram, "Genius is patience," received so splendid a confirmation. It is this admirable combination of theoretical and practical work which the Government proposes that you should honor with a national recompense. Your committee unanimously approves this proposition. The recompense specified consists of a life pension of 12,000 francs. This sum represents very nearly the salary attached to the professorship in the Sorbonne, from which illness has obliged M. Pasteur to resign. In this same report, Paul Weir paid tribute to the disinterestedness of Pasteur, whose discoveries had enriched France to the extent of unnumbered millions, without its having occurred to him to acquire any personal benefit from them. The motion was carried by 532 affirmative votes against 24 negative ones. It was an overwhelming majority. Having once turned his attention to infectious diseases, Pasteur assiduously frequented the Academy of Medicine. Becoming convinced that the majority of deaths were caused by wounds coming in contact with external germs, he recommended to the operating surgeons a method of antiseptic dressing based upon his discovery of microbes in the air. The great English surgeon Lister employed a similar method and obtained excellent results. The French physicians who accepted Pasteur's method saw the percentage of deaths resulting from operations fall off with great rapidity. It was not adopted without opposition, but its efficacy was soon recognized, and today there is no surgeon who does not follow out all of Pasteur's careful injunctions, the heating of the instruments, the sterilization of the dressings, antiseptic washing of the wound, etc. It was in 1876 that science escaped a real danger. Pasteur, yielding to the solicitations of a number of electors, presented himself as candidate at the election of senators from the Jura. He made his electoral campaign with the same seriousness that he displayed in his laboratory, proclaiming in his sign bills and circulars that his only reason for wishing to be elected was that he might have further opportunity to serve France. M. Grévy presented himself in opposition at Lons-le-Saunier, and Pasteur received only 62 votes. He cherished no grudge because of this defeat, but he declared that his incursion into the domain of politics had been a mistake, and he promptly returned to his studies. He had, for that matter, quite enough to do in defending his own scientific work, which had been newly attacked just as he began to believe that it had been definitely established. Bastian, for instance, despite the convincing nature of his experiments on spontaneous generation, disputed his results, and Pasteur, though he might well have rested on his earlier labors, repeated them, if possible, with even greater care, in order to be able to answer him. This experimental method, this close scrutiny of facts which formed the basis of all Pasteur's discoveries, this constant anxiety to leave nothing doubtful or unfinished, has lately been testified to by M. Denis Cochin, a member of the Académie Française and a deputy, on the occasion of the discussion before the Chamber in regard to powder for the Navy. "I have studied chemistry to some extent," he said, "and I recall a remark once made to me by one of our most illustrious scientists. I had finished some small research, the report on which I submitted to M. Pasteur. It began with a phrase that is common enough in manuals of chemistry: 'We know that.' 'What do we know?' Pasteur said to me. we know nothing at all." I replied, "Excuse me, monsieur, but the fact I cited was taken from one of your own writings." I thought I had the best of it, but Pasteur merely rejoined, "That has nothing to do with it. You ought to have verified me." Therein lies Pasteur's whole secret. He always repeated his experiments over and over until he was certain of the truths that they contained, and it was by this means that he triumphed over his adversaries. His controversy with Bastian, together with a posthumous paper by Claude Bernard on fermentations, led him to investigate the fermentation of grapes. Having constructed a hothouse on a small property that he owned near Arbois, Pasteur succeeded in demonstrating that the fermentation was due exclusively to germs which made their appearance on the surface of the grapes and on the bark of the vines at the moment of maturity, and that neither verjuice nor the must of the grape isolated from the skins and stems can undergo fermentation. But although he was still disputed, he had the keen pleasure of seeing certain of his methods eagerly adopted by the big industries. During a visit to a vast Italian silkworm establishment, on the occasion of a congress of silk producers held at Milan, he beheld his own name inscribed across the pediment of the building, in conspicuous homage to the services he had rendered to that industry. On this same occasion they showed him the marvellous results obtained by his process of cellular culture, practically carried out by young girls who had acquired great expertness in the use of the microscope for detecting corpusculous moths. As in the case of the fermentation of grapes, this was a side issue of his theory of germs, but at this epoch he was studying them mainly from the pathological point of view, and we know that he was interested above all in the diseases of a microbic origin. There again he was destined to wage stout battle against routine and prejudice, even within the walls of the Academy of Medicine. It was the disease of anthrax, which annually decimated the herds and flocks of France, that Pasteur chose as the first point of attack. Davesne had previously discovered that the blood of animals infected with this disease contained little rectilinear stick-like organisms, a species of Vibrion, which he named from their form Bacteroides, and which were the cause of the disease. But he had been unable to defend his conclusions against Messieurs Gaillard and Leplat, professors at Val-de-Grâce and Paulbert, who all maintained, after making experiments, that anthrax came from a virus and not from the Bacteroides themselves. It was precisely at this point in the discussion, with the two sides steadfastly maintaining contradictory opinions, each supported equally by facts, that Pasteur, in collaboration with Messieurs Joubert, Chamberlain, and Roux, intervened in his accustomed manner, quite simple, quite clear, and rigorously scientific. Having obtained a fresh drop of blood from an animal infected with anthrax, Pasteur cultivated the Bacteroides in artificial mediums by impregnating each new medium with a drop taken from the preceding culture, so that by the time of the 10th culture he obtained pure Bacteroides. When these were used for inoculation they produced anthrax, without the aid of the original drop of blood, which had disappeared through being diluted to such a degree as to be imperceptible in the later cultures. This amounted to a complete confirmation of Davesne's opinion that these Bacteroides were the cause of the disease of anthrax. In order to render his experiment more decisive, Pasteur established a counterproof by inoculating his medium with a culture from which he had eliminated the Bacteroides by means of filtering it through plaster, and the resulting liquid failed to produce anthrax. Pursuing his studies further, he demonstrated that Messieurs Gaillard and Leplat, who asserted that they had produced anthrax in animals by means of blood which contained no Bacteroides, had been mistaken, and that what they had really done was to produce a different disease by inoculating with a new species of microbe, which he named the septic vibrion. In like manner he refuted Paul Weir, who, after having destroyed the bacteria of anthrax by means of compressed oxygen, claimed that the blood thus deprived of them could nevertheless cause anthrax. Pasteur showed that this blood still contained the germs or spores of Bacteroides, which had greater resistant powers than the Bacteroides themselves, and that it was from them that these cases of anthrax came, so that in any case it was caused either by the Bacteroides or by their spores. This amounted to a definite proof of the parasitic character of this infectious disease. But how was anthrax communicated to animals, and was there any hope of protecting them from it? Again, as in the case of the silkworms, the Minister of Agriculture commissioned Pasteur to make a study of this evil, which ravaged the cattle-raising districts, causing losses which amounted annually to tens of millions. Nothing was known beyond the fact that the animals who were pastured in certain fields that were known as bad fields became infected with anthrax. Pasteur installed himself in the environs of Chartres and began his researches. He was accompanied by M. Roux, who bears witness to the perspicacity of his observations conducted on the spot. The harvest had been gathered, he wrote, and nothing remained but the stubble. Pasteur's attention was drawn to a certain portion of the field because of the different coloring of the earth. The owner explained that this was the spot where they had buried the sheep who had died of anthrax the preceding year. Pasteur, who always examined things closely, noticed on the surface of the soil a multitude of little lumps of earth thrown up by earthworms. The idea then occurred to him that in their continuous journeyings from the lower depths to the surface, the worms carried above ground some of the soil rich in the humus that surrounded the dead bodies, and along with it some of the spores of anthrax which it contained. But Pasteur never stopped short at conjectures. He immediately passed on to experiments. These justified his expectations. The earth contained in one of the worms, when used to inoculate guinea pigs, produced anthrax in them. Roux, L'œuvre médicale de Pasteur, Agenda du chimiste, 1896. Pasteur had studied first the active cause of the disease, and next its mode of propagation, and found that the spores penetrated into the organism of the animals, sheep or cattle, through the mucous membranes of their mouths, where they were torn by the dry and prickly grass. How were the flocks and herds to be preserved? It was through his study of chicken cholera, carried on simultaneously with that of anthrax, that he was set upon the right path. He had noticed that the cholera microbes, at this time the word microbe as a generic term for vibrions, Bacteroides, etc., had just been coined by Sédiot, a surgeon at Strasbourg, approved by Littré, and generally adopted by scientists. If left exposed to the air, and then used for a new culture, lost their virulence to the point of becoming actually harmless. This attenuation was due to the oxygen in the air. This discovery was destined to revolutionize the science of medicine, and to lead Pasteur to the employment of vaccines, which he obtained after several years of extremely delicate experiments. It was on the 28th of February, 1881, that Pasteur made his communication to the Academy of Sciences regarding the vaccine of anthrax. It was received by some with enthusiasm and by others with mistrust. Pasteur himself was certain of the effects of his discovery. Healthy animals inoculated with the attenuated virus would surely be rendered immune to anthrax. He consented to make a test on a large scale, and this test justly remained celebrated. It began on the 5th of May, 1881, on a farm near Pouilly-le-Fort, near Melun, under the auspices of the Society of Agriculture of that town. The conditions imposed were most rigorous, but Pasteur was confident of victory. 50 sheep and 10 cows were turned over to him. Of the former lot, 25 were to be vaccinated with an attenuated virus and then to receive, together with the other 25 which had not been vaccinated, an inoculation of extremely virulent anthrax microbes, while for the second lot the experiment was to be tried upon 6 vaccinated animals and 4 not vaccinated. Pasteur asserted that all those which had been vaccinated would resist the disease of anthrax, while those which had not been vaccinated would all die. This claim had the audacity of genius, and throughout the duration of the experiments the illustrious scientists underwent alternations of joyous hope and feverish anxiety. But on the 2nd of June, the day fixed by Pasteur for judging the results, after the inoculation with virulent Bacteroides, which took place on May 31st, it proved to be a triumphant occasion for him on the farm at Pouilly-le-Fort. The prefect of Seine-et-Marne, several deputies and senators, veterinaries and journalists were present, all quivering with impatience, and Pasteur's predictions were realized in every particular amid the congratulations of an enthusiastic throng. Every one of the animals which had been inoculated but not vaccinated had contracted anthrax and died, while all the animals that had been both inoculated and vaccinated escaped all symptoms of illness. On the 13th of June, Pasteur communicated to the Academy of Sciences the result of his experiments at Pouilly-le-Fort, which was henceforth to be known as the Pasteur Farm. In view of their success, which had made an enormous sensation, he was able to say, "We now possess virus vaccines against anthrax capable of warding off the deadly disease without ever proving fatal themselves, living vaccines that may be cultivated at will and transported anywhere without suffering harm, vaccines, in short, that are prepared by a method which we have reason to believe is susceptible of being generalized, because it has once already been put into practice for the purpose of obtaining vaccine against chicken cholera. Because of the character of the conditions which I have here enumerated, and looking at the question only from the scientific point of view, I may say that the discovery of vaccine for anthrax constitutes a perceptible progress in advance of Jenner's vaccine, because the latter was not obtained as a result of experiments." Pasteur no longer met with the same obstacles that had confronted his method for the culture of silkworms. His vaccines for anthrax were in demand in every cattle-raising district of France. Within 1 year after the above-mentioned experiments, the number of animals vaccinated had risen to 613,740 sheep and 83,946 cattle. But before this triumph, which had even been questioned in certain circles, he had to answer numerous criticisms at the Academy of Medicine, where too many of the dear masters refused to recognize him as anything more than a chemist. He was forced to fight on behalf of his germ theory against the adherents of the old school, who refused to accept not only the novelty of the theory, but even the very existence of germs. He was forced to defend his experiments when they were called in question, and one day he actually brought some chickens into a meeting at the Academy of Medicine in order to convince Colin that he could infect them with anthrax. Pasteur was an energetic adversary, and sometimes a violent one if anyone affected not to understand him, and he defended what he believed to be the truth with crude and caustic eloquence. It very nearly led him into a duel with Jules Guérin in October of 1881 because of his rather rough treatment of him on the subject of smallpox. This whole epoch of Pasteur's life, extending from 1877 to 1882, was extremely prolific. He was possessed by what amounted to a fever for work, and his ideas radiated in all directions. His laboratory was a veritable hive. Together with his anthrax vaccine, he found that of chicken cholera, and his pupil Thuillier discovered the microbe of rouget in swine. But in the midst of all his polemics and his divers other duties, Pasteur's chief preoccupation was that of human diseases. He turned his attention to puerperal fever, and having demonstrated that it was due to a microbe, he outlined for doctors a whole series of measures of precaution and cleanliness that were destined to save many a mother. He collected notes on the plague, he made a study of boils, he haunted the hospitals in company of his students, notwithstanding his sensitiveness and physical repugnance. The sight of corpses, the sad necessity of autopsies caused him actual repulsion, writes M. Roux. How many times we have seen him hastily leave the amphitheatre of the hospitals because he was actually ill. But his love of science, his curiosity to know the truth were even stronger. He always came back on the morrow. After having conquered himself, in order to bring to humanity effective remedies against infectious diseases, Pasteur was destined to conquer the doctors themselves, bound though they were to the old formulas, the antiquated conceptions, and who could not, without some vexation and alarm, behold the overthrow of their tranquillity and peaceful routine. But the excitement aroused by the discovery of anthrax vaccine, which opened such great hopes for the future, was confirmed by the learned societies and the ruling powers. The Society of the Agriculturalists of France awarded Pasteur on the 21st of February, 1881, a Medal of Honor, and the government bestowed upon him the Grand Cordon of the Legion of Honor. In this connection we meet with a typical manifestation of Pasteur's character. He sent word that he would not accept this elevation to a higher rank unless his two collaborators, Chamberland and Roux, were each to receive the red ribbon. End of section 9. Section 10 of Louis Pasteur by Albert Keim and Louis Lumet. Translated by Frederick Taber Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 7. The Sovereignty of Genius, Part 1. In spite of a small refractory group, Pasteur's rise into fame was continuous, and his genius radiated throughout the scientific world of Europe. The government had appointed him as delegate to the International Medical Congress held at London in April 1881, and there he was the recipient of exceptional honors. Monsieur Valéry Radot cites a very beautiful letter which Pasteur wrote to his wife concerning the attentions that he received. When the president of the Congress, Sir James Paget, happened to mention his name, the entire assemblage burst into applause, and Pasteur was obliged to rise and salute his colleagues. I was very proud, he wrote, very proud internally, not for myself, you know how I feel in regard to triumphs, but for my country, when I realized that I was being exceptionally distinguished in the midst of this immense concourse of foreigners, of Germans especially, who are here in considerable numbers, far greater numbers than there are Frenchmen, of whom, nevertheless, taken altogether, there are not less than 250. Jean-Baptiste and René were present at the session. You can judge of their emotion. After the session, luncheon at the home of Sir James Paget, with the Prussian Prince seated on his right and the Prince of Wales on his left. Then a gathering of 25 to 30 guests in the drawing-room. Sir James presented me to the Prince of Wales, before whom I made my bow, telling him that I was happy to salute the friend of France. Yes, he answered me, a great friend. Sir James Paget had the good taste not to ask me to be presented to the Prussian Prince. Although under such circumstances it was impossible to be otherwise than courteous, I could not have made up my mind to give the appearance of having asked to be presented to him. But all of a sudden the Prince himself came up to me and said, "Monsieur Pasteur, allow me to introduce myself to you," and to tell you that I was one of those who applauded you this morning." And he continued talking to me in the friendliest manner. Receptions and ceremonies did not make Pasteur forget his serious work, and in a lecture intended as an answer to Bastien, who maintained that germs were born from the organism containing them, he described his labors, his methods, his discovery of vaccines, and the way in which he had proved experimentally that germs were parasites. This exposition by Pasteur, in which he summed up his entire life as a scientist and all the opportunities which it had opened up to the future of science, was printed in English and sent to all the members of the House of Commons. The greatest English scientists, it should be added, Tyndall, Paget, and Lister, had rallied to the support of the Pasteur methods. Upon returning to France, he set forth immediately for Bordeaux, where he hoped to have a chance to study yellow fever, which had broken out among the crew of the Condé, just arrived from Senegal. Yet, at the same time that he was anxiously concerned regarding these 6 sailors, among whom he hoped to find subjects for experiments, he was profiting by his leisure moments to visit the Bordeaux library, where he read the works of Littré assiduously and with pen in hand. The fact was that certain members of the Académie Française had asked Pasteur to present himself as candidate for the place of the learned linguist then recently deceased. We have seen that Pasteur, the great revolutionist of science, had a deep respect for degrees, hierarchies, social orders, and honorary distinctions, and it seemed to him that this was an honor out of all proportion to his own literary claims. He hesitated, and it needed all the insistence of his friends, as well as the thought that it was a tribute paid to science rather than to him personally, to decide him to offer himself as a candidate. He was elected on December 8th, 1881, to the 31st chair, whose previous occupants had been de la Chambre, 1635, Desmarais, 1670, La Monnoye, 1713, La Rivière, 1727, Ardillon, 1730, Thomas, 1766, Gilbert, 1786, Fontaine, 1803, Villemain, 1821, and Littré, 1881. It may well be said that even though he was not a man of letters, Pasteur's name will remain as the one which has shed the greatest lustre upon that particular chair. His reception took place on the 27th of April, 1882, and it was the philosopher Ernest Renan who, as master of ceremonies, welcomed the scientist. Their 2 addresses, each in its respective form and spirit, are admirable monuments of the French language and of French thought. That of Pasteur, grave, austere, profound, paying homage to the merit of Littré, opening up marvelous glimpses into the abysses of infinity; that of Renan, respectful towards science, complimentary, witty, and permeated with a serene and subtle philosophy. Louis Pasteur was listened to with a religious attention, and something like a shiver passed over his hearers when he read, in a voice which, while not strong, was animated by an ardent conviction, this celebrated passage: "Above and beyond the starry vault, what is there? Other new starlit skies. So be it. And above and beyond them, the human mind, urged on by an invincible force, will never cease to ask itself, what is there beyond? What if the mind should try to stop at some point, either in time or space? Since that point where it stops marks only a finite greatness, merely greater than those which preceded it, the mind has scarcely begun to contemplate it, when the implacable question returns, and never can its curiosity be silenced. It does no good to answer, above and beyond are space, time, greatness without limit. No one comprehends these words. Whoever proclaims the existence of the infinite, and no one can evade doing so, sums up in that affirmation more of the supernatural than is contained in all the miracles of all religions. For the notion of the infinite has this double character of being undeniable and incomprehensible. When this notion once takes possession of our understanding, there is nothing left but to prostrate ourselves before it. More than that, at this moment of poignant anguish, we must needs crave mercy from our own brains. All the sources of intellectual life threaten to give way. We feel ourselves on the point of yielding to the sublime folly of Pascal. This positive and primordial notion is gladly set aside with all its consequences by modern positivism in the social life of today. On all sides I find the inevitable expression of this idea of the infinite in our world. It is through this that the supernatural lies at the bottom of every heart. The idea of God is one form of the idea of the infinite. So long as the mystery of the infinite weighs upon human thought, temples will be raised to the cult of the infinite, whether God be called Brahma, Allah, Jehovah, or Jesus. And on the pavement of these temples we will see men kneeling, prostrated, lost in the thought of the infinite. Metaphysics does nothing more than transfer to within ourselves this dominant notion of the infinite, and is not the conception of the ideal merely a faculty reflected from the infinite, which leads us, when in the presence of beauty, to conceive of a still higher form of beauty? Are science and the passionate desire to understand anything else than the effect of that spur toward knowledge which the mystery of the universe has placed in our souls? Where are the true sources of human dignity, of liberty, of modern democracy, unless they are contained in the idea of the infinite, before which all men are equal? His hearers had applauded the words of the scientist who had thus dizzily scrutinized the mysteries of the world. They were about to hear the phrases of the philosopher, who was pondering them with a smile. Ernest Renan welcomed Pasteur with words of graceful compliment and noble distinction. We are quite incompetent to bestow fitting praise upon that which constitutes your true glory, he said, those admirable experiments through which you attain the very confines of life, your ingenious fashion of interrogating nature, which so many times has won from her the clearest kind of replies, those precious discoveries which day by day are being transformed into conquests of the highest importance to humanity. You would repudiate our praises, habituated as you are to value only the judgments of your peers, and in the scientific debates, aroused by this host of new ideas, you would not care to see the appreciations of men of letters intruding among the acclaims of scientists related to you by the brotherhood of glory and toil. Between you and your rival scientists we have no right to intervene. But apart from the basis of science, which is not our province, there is one criterion, monsieur, in regard to which our knowledge of the human mind gives us the right to express an opinion. There is something which we are able to recognize in its most diverse manifestations, something which belongs in equal degree to Galileo, to Pascal, to Michelangelo, and to Molière, something which constitutes the sublimity of the poet, the profundity of the philosopher, the fascination of the orator, the divination of the savant. This common basis of all beautiful and true works, this divine flame, this indefinable breath which is the inspiration of science, literature, and art, we find in you, monsieur. It is genius. No one else has traversed with so assured a step the circles of elemental nature. Your scientific life is like a luminous trail across the great night of the infinitely small, in those furthest depths of being where life is born. After analyzing the work of Pasteur and pointing out the strong continuity of his researches, Renan spoke of his virtues. Your austere life, he said, wholly consecrated to disinterested research, is the best response to those who regard our century as having lost the heritage of the great gifts of the soul. your laborious assiduity, which has been a stranger to all recreation and repose." Then, having recognized the merits of Littré, Renan concluded with rare and exquisite subtlety: "Your absolute devotion to science gave you the right, monsieur, to succeed to such a man, and to recall to us his great and reverend memory. You will find in our meetings a source of relaxation for your mind continually occupied with new discoveries. This association, with a company composed of all sorts of opinions and every type of mind, will be congenial to you. Here we have the pleasant laugh of comedy, the pure and tender romance, the soaring flight of poetry with its harmonious rhythm. There we have all the subtlety of moral observation, the most exquisite analysis of the works of the mind, the profound significance of history. None of this will shake your faith in your experiments. The right acid will remain the right acid, the left acid will remain the left acid. But you will find that the prudent labours of M. Littré also had their value. You will follow with some interest the care taken by our critical philosophy to eliminate error, by mistrusting its own procedure and limiting the extent of its observations. When you see how many good things are taught by those branches of letters that are frivolous in appearance, you will come to believe that the discreet doubt, the smile, the fine play of wit, of which Pascal speaks, also have their value. Among us you will find no experiments to make, but that modest power of observation, from which you demand so much, will suffice to procure you many a pleasant hour. We will communicate our hesitations to you, and you will communicate your assurance to us. You will bring us above all your glory, your genius, and the renown of your discoveries. Monsieur, I bid you welcome." End of Section 10. Section 11 of Louis Pasteur by Albert Keim and Louis Lumet, translated by Frederick Taber Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 7. The Sovereignty of Genius, Part 2. Pasteur was succeeded in the Académie Française by Gaston Paris, the restorer of the old national literature of France, and on the occasion of his reception the illustrious scientist J. Bertrand, who responded to his address, told some delicious anecdotes of Pasteur, his works, and his character. Already illustrious, he said, but not yet celebrated, Pasteur was appointed to express before the statue of Thénard the homage of the École Normale. He was scheduled to speak among the very last of the orators. When he arose to make his address, the crowd, weary of eloquence, continued to applaud, but had ceased to listen. Without wasting time by relating for the 15th occasion trivial anecdotes and doubtful legends, without even mentioning hydrogen peroxide, Pasteur paid Thénard the admirable tribute of dwelling only on his kindliness, recalling only his sense of justice. From the opening words, his earnest and effective phrases penetrated to the very heart, and while even the remotest hearers followed him with close attention, tears of emotion filled the eyes of all. Occasions such as that were rare. It was only when he was forced to it that Pasteur showed the brilliance of his mind. One day, at the Academy of Sciences, two contradictory spirits were raising objections unworthy of attention regarding certain discoveries. After a crushing reply, Pasteur, apostrophizing them both together, said to the one, "Do you know what you lack? You lack the power of observation." And to the other, "And you, the power of reasoning." A murmur arose. The Academy was protesting against the lack of courtesy in this form of speech. Pasteur at once interrupted himself. "The heat of the discussion carried me away," he said. "I regret my impetuosity. I beg that my colleagues will accept my sincere apology." His extreme simplicity and frankness pleased the members, when suddenly he added, "I have acknowledged myself at fault. I have willingly made my excuses. May I not be permitted to plead an extenuating circumstance? It is this, that what I said was true. And after a moment's reflection he added, absolutely true. A unanimous and appreciative laugh enlivened the Academy, and like sensible persons the two adversaries joined in. In accordance with Renan's expressed desire, Pasteur frequently attended the meetings of the Académie Française. He sometimes went there in the company of M. Duret, the Minister of Public Instruction, who had encouraged his early efforts. For it happened that one of them lived at the École Normale in the Rue d'Ulm, and the other in the Rue de Médicis. On Thursday, when they had taken a modest fiacre to drive to the Institute, it happened to be Duret who, upon arriving at the destination, tendered a 5-franc piece to the coachman. "No change," said the latter. "Then keep the whole piece in memory of the occasion. You have driven the leading scientist of the century." Pasteur immediately put his hand in his pocket, drew out a brand new crown, and said, "Here, my friend, take this also, because you have driven the greatest minister of the Second Empire." The coachman looked somewhat bewildered, but eminently happy, while the two academicians entered the court of the Palais Mazarin, still laughing. For Pasteur, one homage succeeded another. The town of Aubenas, saved from ruin by his discoveries in regard to the disease of silkworms, presented him in May of 1882 with a work of art in which the microscope was portrayed as rendering possible the cultivation of healthy silkworms. Next it was Nîmes, which awarded him a medal for his vaccine against anthrax, and next Montpellier, where the Agricultural Society organized a solemn meeting for the purpose of thanking him for having vanquished anthrax, and to beg him to cure the rot of the phylloxera. He had become the great magician. But he had against him certain beloved brethren who, either in good faith or otherwise, combated the doctrine of microbes, and he had to sustain some hard contests against the doubting Peters of the Academy of Medicine. On the other hand, the German school, with Dr. Koch at its head, disputed his discoveries, going so far as to deny wholly the value of his observations. But he was so certain of the positive results he had obtained that he sent his pupil Thuillier as a delegate to Germany with virulent cultures of anthrax as well as attenuated viruses, thus carrying his experiments into the territory of the enemy. He suffered from such ill will, and from all these quarrels ceaselessly renewed. His resentment, however, was softened by the admiration he received from the great majority of scientists. The Academy of Sciences having taken the initiative, the Learned Society subscribed toward a medal to be presented to him, containing his profile modelled by Alphée Dubois, with this inscription: "To Louis Pasteur, from his colleagues, his friends, and his admirers." This token was presented to him on the 25th of January, 1882, and Pasteur had the pleasure of seeing his old teacher, Dumas, heading the delegation, which consisted of Bozingot, Boulet, Jamin, Daubré, Berton, Tisserand, and Devaisnes, and of hearing him deliver the presentation speech. Dumas, whom as an obscure youth he had listened to at the Sorbonne, leaving the lecture room, moved to the point of tears. The government did not remain insensible to the enthusiastic movement in recognition of the discoveries of Pasteur. Upon the second report by Paul Bert, the French Chambers raised Pasteur's pension to 25,000 francs, in imitation of Germany, which had accorded Jenner 250,000 francs in 1802 and 500,000 in 1807 for his vaccine against smallpox. Paul Bert's report summed up Pasteur's works as follows: "They can be classed," he wrote, "in 3 series. They constitute 3 great discoveries. The first may be formulated as follows. Each fermentation is the product of the development of a special microbe. The second may be formulated: each infectious disease, or at least those which have been studied by M. Pasteur or his immediate disciples, is produced by the development of some special microbe within the organism. The third may be expressed as follows: the microbe of an infectious disease, if cultivated under certain specified conditions, becomes attenuated in respect to its harmful qualities. It has been converted from a virus into a vaccine. As practical consequences of the first discovery, M. Pasteur has given rules for the manufacture of vinegar and beer, and he has shown how beer and wine may be preserved from those secondary fermentations which turn them sour, cause l'amère, la graisse, la pousse, and prevent their transportation, and often even their preservation on the spot where they are produced. As practical consequences of the second discovery, M. Pasteur has prescribed the rules to be followed in order to protect our flocks and herds from the contamination of anthrax and our silkworms from the maladies which destroy them. On the other hand, our surgeons have succeeded under its guidance in almost completely doing away with erysipelas and other purulent infections which formerly caused the death of so many patients after operations. As practical consequences of the third discovery, M. Pasteur has prescribed the rules to be followed in order to save the horses, cattle, and sheep, and in point of fact has saved them from the disease of anthrax, which annually caused their death in France to the value of 20 million francs. Swine also are now protected from rouget, which decimated them, and the barn-door fowl from the chicken cholera, which caused terrible ravages among them. And now there is every reason to hope that hydrophobia also will soon be conquered. The motion calling for an increase of the national recompense was passed unanimously, but a ceremony even dearer to Pasteur's heart than this grateful homage of an entire people was in preparation in the little town of his birth. On the 14th of July, 1883, a commemorative tablet was placed upon the house in which Pasteur was born, and M. Kempfen, director of the Beaux-Arts, who had been delegated by the government, said at its inauguration: "In the name of the government of the Republic, I salute this inscription, which recalls the fact that on the 27th of December, 1822, there was born in this little street one who was destined to become one of the greatest scientists of a century whose greatness lies in science, and one who by his admirable labors has augmented the glory of his native land and won the gratitude of all humanity." Pasteur spoke in reply, and his address reveals the great qualities of his generous heart, his extreme personal modesty, and the pride which he cherished on behalf of science alone. "Gentlemen," he said, "I am deeply moved by the honor done me by the town of Dole, but permit me, while expressing my appreciation, to utter a protest against this excess of glory. In according me a homage which is rendered only to the illustrious dead, you are usurping in advance the judgment of posterity. Will posterity ratify your decision, and ought you not, Monsieur the Mayor, have prudently advised the Municipal Council not to pass such a hasty resolution? But having made my protest, gentlemen, against this public proof of an admiration which I do not deserve, allow me to say that I am touched and moved to the bottom of my soul. Your sympathetic tribute has united in this commemorative tablet the two great things which have formed at once the passion and the charm of my life, my love of science and my attachment to the paternal hearth. Oh, my father and my mother! Oh, my dear lost ones who lived so modestly in this little house! It is you to whom I owe everything. Your enthusiasm, my valiant mother, you passed on to me. If I have always associated the greatness of science with the greatness of my native land, it is because I was impregnated with the sentiments which you inspired in me. And you, my dear father, whose life was as hard as your own hard craft, it is you who taught me what can be done by patience and long effort. It is you to whom I owe tenacious persistence in the daily task. Not only did you have those qualities of perseverance which result in useful lives, but you also had admiration for great men and great deeds. To aim higher and higher, to learn more and more, to seek constantly to rise, such were the things you taught me. I can still see you at the close of your laborious day, reading in the evening the account of some battle from one of the volumes of contemporary history, which recalled to your mind the glorious epoch of which you had been witness. While teaching me to read, you also took pains to teach me the greatness of France. My blessings on you both, my dear parents, for all that you have done, and let me pass on to you the homage which has today been paid to this house. Gentlemen, I thank you for having permitted me to say publicly what has been in my thoughts for 60 years. I thank you for this festival and for your welcome, and I thank the town of Dole, which never loses sight of any of her children, and which has held me in such affectionate memory. But the honours paid to his genius, whether of a private or public character, failed to turn him aside from his laborious task. At the beginning of the month of August 1883, at which time a formidable epidemic of cholera had broken out in Egypt, he sent out a small band of his pupils, Messieurs Roux, Nocard, Strauss, and Thuillier, for the purpose of studying the frightful malady, and seeking some means of checking its ravages. Thuillier was destined to die during this scientific expedition, stricken down by the scourge in the fullness of youth and hope. He was only 26 years of age. Through the pious cares of the Pasteur Institute, his medallion has been placed upon one of the walls of the garden in testimony of his valor and devotion. The studies pursued by Pasteur and his pupils were, at this epoch, extended to every malady of microbic origin, but more particularly to hydrophobia, that terror of the country districts, and which the illustrious scientist was determined to vanquish by the combined power of genius and persistence. He was interrupted for a few weeks by the obligation of representing France at the celebration of the tricentenary of the University of Edinburgh, in company with Messieurs Carreau, Greard, de Lesseps, Guizot, and Eugène Guillaume. In London, the French delegates found a private parlour car awaiting them, thanks to Mr. Younger, a Scotch brewer, who wished in this manner to thank Pasteur for his studies in relation to beer. It was a recognition of the fine generosity of the French savant, who had enriched commerce and manufactures to the extent of millions, while refusing to retain anything for himself. And that is one of the brightest sides of the glory of France. End of section 11. Section 12 of Louis Pasteur by Albert Keim and Louis Lumet, translated by Frederick Taber Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 8. Hydrophobia. Mad dogs were formerly the terror of the countryside. The mysterious character of the malady, its frightful consequences to those whom it attacked, classed it among those scourges of the fields against which no certain remedy was known. In ancient times, Pliny the Elder advised those who had been bitten to eat the liver of the dog who had done the harm, while Gallian prescribed as a remedy the eyes of crabs. During the Middle Ages, which were haunted by mad dogs, the remedies used were omelettes made of ground oyster shells and cauterization of the wound with red-hot irons. But most frequently they stifled the unhappy sufferers between two mattresses. In the 18th century, a lieutenant of police named Lenoir founded a prize of £1,200 to be awarded by the Royal Society of Medicine to the author of the best paper on the methods of curing hydrophobia. It was won by a certain Dr. Roux, a physician at Dijon, and among the methods of saving those who had been bitten he recommended cauterization with hot irons, and more especially with antimony trichloride, butter of antimony. In the 18th century the problem of hydrophobia, although it had been studied more scientifically, had made but little progress until Pasteur caused a sensation by discovering its solution. He began his researches in 1880 with the collaboration of Drs. Chamberlain, Roux, and Thuillier. We cannot follow them through all the details of the long succession of exceedingly delicate experiments that often had to be commenced all over again in order to obtain assured results, but a very simple summary will make it clear that Pasteur's genius was as fruitful as ever, and that his illness had in no wise impaired his qualities as an experimenter. On the 10th of December, 1880, Pasteur, being informed by Dr. Lanlong that he had under treatment at Trousseau a 5-year-old child who had been bitten by a mad dog, went to obtain a specimen of his saliva. In the saliva he discovered a microbe which was not that of hydrophobia, and which, when injected into rabbits, caused their death within 2 days of a different disease. Nevertheless, the saliva contained the microbes of hydrophobia, but they lost all their virulence within 24 hours. Since rabies chiefly affects the nerve centres, Pasteur inoculated rabbits and dogs with the cranial marrow of rabid dogs. The subjects inoculated developed hydrophobia after a greater or less lapse of time, and the experiments became difficult to follow and to control. In order to hasten the period of inoculation, Pasteur conceived the idea of injecting the matter containing the germs directly into the dogs' skulls, but the idea of trepanning necessitated by the injection was repugnant to him. He could witness without much distress a simple operation such as subcutaneous inoculation, writes M. Roux, although even then, if the animal cried a little, Pasteur would be overcome with pity and make his escape, lavishing on the victim words of consolation and encouragement, which would have seemed comical if they had not been so touching. The thought that a dog's skull would have to be perforated was most unpleasant to him. He was keenly anxious to have the experiment tried, yet he shrank from seeing it undertaken. I did it one day when he was absent. The following day, when I reported to him that the intracranial inoculation offered no difficulties, he fell to pitying the dog. Poor beast! Its brain is no doubt ruptured. It must be paralyzed. Without reply, I descended to the basement to get the animal, and brought it back with me to the laboratory. Pasteur was not fond of dogs, but when he saw this one full of spirits and curiously exploring the premises, he exhibited the keenest satisfaction, and began to lavish terms of endearment upon it. He felt an infinite gratitude toward this particular dog for having stood the trepanning so well, and thus having put an end to all his scruples in regard to future trepanning. The experiment succeeded, and the period of inoculation was reduced to 20 days, and it was demonstrated that the principal seat of the malady was in the nervous centres. To the first results, which were of a theoretic character, Pasteur became ambitious to add others of a practical nature. Was it possible to render dogs immune to hydrophobia after they had been bitten, as he had rendered cattle and sheep immune to anthrax, and could this immunity be extended to man? The problem was quite complex, for he did not know the microbe of hydrophobia, which had barely been detected by Dr. Roux, in the form of points almost imperceptible under the most powerful microscopes. It was here that the inventive genius of Pasteur displayed itself. Since he could not cultivate these microbes in appropriate liquids and attenuate them according to the method that he had used in the case of anthrax and chicken cholera, he conceived the idea of cultivating them from rabbit to rabbit, and in this way he obtained a fixed maximum of virulence, which reduced the period of inoculation to 7 days. But how was the virus to be transformed into vaccine? Pasteur observed that the infected marrows, when brought into contact with dry air, lost their virulence in proportion to the length of time they were exposed, becoming almost harmless after 15 days. The attenuated virus having been found by a process which, although hardly scientific, was certain, the next facts to ascertain were, first, whether inoculation with this vaccine virus would render dogs resistant to hydrophobia, and secondly, whether inoculation would prevent the disease from appearing and developing in animals that had been bitten. The experiments were long and full of difficulties. The laboratory in the Rue d'Ulm no longer sufficed to contain all the subjects. The State placed at Pasteur's disposal more extensive quarters at Villeneuve-l'Étang near Saint-Cloud. Finally, his experiments achieved this double result. Hydrophobia could be communicated to animals by inoculation, and on the other hand, inoculation with attenuated virus rendered dogs resistant to hydrophobia and prevented the disease from appearing in those who had been bitten. Pasteur was sure of the efficacy of his discovery, but he hesitated to apply his method to human beings. "I have not yet dared to make any attempt upon man," he wrote to the Emperor of Brazil, "in spite of my confidence as to the result, and in spite of the numerous opportunities that have been offered me since my last lecture at the Academy of Sciences. I am too much afraid of a failure which would compromise my future plans. I want first to collect a multitude of successful cases of the treatment of animals. In this respect matters are going well. I already have numerous examples of dogs rendered immune after having been bitten. I take 2 dogs and I cause them to be bitten by another dog that is mad. I vaccinate one of them and I leave the other without treatment. The latter dies of hydrophobia, the one that was vaccinated is immune. But no matter to what extent I should multiply these examples of the prophylaxis of hydrophobia in dogs, it seems to me that my hand would inevitably tremble when the time came to apply the treatment to a human being. Here is where the high and powerful initiative of the sovereign of a state might intervene most profitably for the greatest good of humanity. If I were king or emperor or even president of the Republic, this is the way in which I should exercise my right to pardon prisoners condemned to death. I should offer the condemned man, through his lawyer, on the eve of his client's execution, the choice between imminent death and an experiment consisting of preventive inoculation of hydrophobia for the purpose of rendering his constitution immune to that disease. Aside from the risks of these experiments, the life of the condemned man would be spared. In case the experiments should succeed, in point of fact I am sure they would, in order to protect society which had previously condemned the criminal, he should be kept in custody for the rest of his life. Every condemned man would accept, for the only thing which a condemned man fears is death. This brings me to the question of cholera, which Your Majesty also had the goodness to discuss with me. Neither Drs. Strauss and Roux nor Dr. Koch have succeeded in infecting animals with cholera. Hence there is a great uncertainty regarding the bacillus which Dr. Koch believes to be the cause of cholera. We ought to be allowed to try to give cholera to criminals condemned to death by making them swallow cultures of these bacilli. As soon as the malady should make its appearance, the remedies regarded as most efficacious could immediately be administered. I attach so much importance to these measures that if Your Majesty should share my views, I would gladly set out for Rio Janeiro, despite my age and state of health, in order to devote myself to this sort of study of the prophylaxis of hydrophobia, or the contagion of cholera, and the remedies to be applied to it. Letters cited by M. Valéry Radot in La Vie de Pasteur. His conscience became so troubled by this weight of responsibility that the famous scientist even thought of inoculating himself, when at last his experiments repeatedly tried upon animals gave such unmistakable results that he decided to apply his methods to human beings. The first inoculation was given to a boy 9 years old, an Alsatian named Joseph Meister, who had been seriously bitten by a mad dog on the 6th of July, 1885. He had 14 wounds and was in a lamentable state. The treatment began with the injection of the least virulent vaccine obtained from infected marrow 14 days old. The child stood it admirably, but Pasteur became anxious, distressed to the point of sleeplessness, when it became necessary to pass on to the virulent vaccines. How would the young patient respond to them? He stood them all without any apparent trouble, and 2 months from the time when he was first attacked, not a sign of hydrophobia had developed, nor did young Meister subsequently ever show any symptom of it. Then came another lad who had played the part of hero, a young shepherd by the name of J.B. Jupil, who successfully underwent the second treatment for hydrophobia. This boy, 15 years of age, had fought with a mad dog on the lands of Villers-Farlay in the Jura in order to save his comrades, 5 other young shepherds. He had been badly bitten in the struggle, and his case was more serious than that of Meister, because a whole week had passed between the day on which he had received his wounds and that on which he could be inoculated. Like the first patient, he received the hypodermic from Dr. Granchet with the assistance of Vulpian on Tuesday, October 29, 1885, and after a series of injections of vaccines, he was immune to hydrophobia. It was at the meeting of the Academy of Sciences, held October 26, 1885, that Pasteur made his communication on the subject of hydrophobia, preventive vaccination, and vaccination after bites as applied to man. Dr. Vulpian responded and paid homage to the genius of Pasteur. The Academy will not be surprised if, as a member of the section of medicine and surgery, I ask the floor in order to express the sentiments of admiration inspired in me by the communication of M. Pasteur. These will be shared, I am convinced, by the medical profession as a whole. Hydrophobia, that terrible disease against which all therapeutic efforts have hitherto failed, has at last found its remedy. M. Pasteur, who has had no precursor but himself along this route, has been led through a series of researches, uninterruptedly pursued for years, to create a method of treatment by the aid of which it is possible to prevent beyond all question the development of hydrophobia in a man recently bitten by a mad dog. I say beyond all question because after what I have seen in M. Pasteur's laboratory, I cannot myself doubt the permanent success of this treatment whenever it is applied in its full extent within a few days after the bite has been received. It becomes at once necessary to take steps toward the organization of a public system of treatment for hydrophobia according to the Pasteur method. Every individual bitten by a mad dog ought to be able to benefit by this great discovery, which puts the seal of glory upon our illustrious colleague and is destined to redound greatly to the honor of our country. It was Pasteur's destiny never to triumph through any of his discoveries until after he had overcome desperate resistance. The value of his method was questioned by a large part of the profession. He was ridiculed, and the comic papers published caricatures upon his work. Pasteur's enemies, who had not even yet disarmed in the presence of his genius, renewed their attacks in connection with a failure which occurred in December 1885, the death of a young girl, Louise Le Pelletier, who had been inoculated 37 days after she was bitten. Nevertheless, all resistance and all perfidy disappeared beneath the immense flood of enthusiasm which had been aroused by Pasteur's discoveries. A public system of vaccination against hydrophobia was installed, and people flocked there from all parts of France and from every other country. Within 1 year and 2 months, from October 1885 to December 1886, 2,682 persons who had been bitten were treated there, and out of this number only 31 succumbed. The efficacy of the method had been demonstrated. Pasteur took an interest in the children whom he treated, and lavished caresses and presents on them. He wrote to them after the course of treatment was over, trying to keep watch of their subsequent lives and urging upon them the advantages of honesty and industry. The great man, surrounded with the halo of glory and overburdened with his labors and his thoughts, found himself paternally drawn toward these little ones, and they were his best source of repose. End of Section 12.